Hey folks, Prof. K here, back with part 2 of our look at problem solving. Quick review of the first part. Here's our model here. 4 stages: understand, make a plan, try the plan, check the results. Good results, you're done. Unsatisfactory results, you've got to go back, and now you're into our old buddy, the feedback loop. What are some problems with problem solving? The first ones that we looked at in that first video, sometimes we don't actually recognize that there's a problem. So we always have to remember that you have to get people to agree that there's a problem so that you can solve it. So I like to call that step 0. And then I drop it into the model. If we recognize that there's a problem, then we can get into all these other things. Okay, a negative consensus. Here's the thing. Identifying that there's a problem is much easier than understanding it and solving it. So one thing that we might do is we might recognize that there's a problem, and we don't want to try and understand it. We think we already understand it. We're fine. We know enough. So we might move too fast. And if we move too fast, we end up at step 2 instead of at step 1. And then that could cause problems where you're stuck in here in a loop, getting lousy results and not being able to go back to understand the problem so that you can cycle through and solve your problem. So ideally, we dig into step 1. Still review from last part. We dig in. If we think of the elephant as the problem, maybe there are a lot of people involved. Let's call them the stakeholders in solving the problem. Maybe they've got a finger on one important part of a problem. We've got to get them all together and try and understand the problem. We do that by collecting information and analyzing it. And if we think we understand, we can go on to step 2. Okay, so what happens when we get to step 2? Welcome to step 2, make a plan. There are some problems that you get to when it's time to make a plan if you've managed to understand it. One of them is that perceptions have to be dealt with as realities. In the real world, if you've got a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people involved, problem solving is the art of the possible. That's actually a saying from politics. Someone said that politics is the art of the possible. In other words, let's figure out what we can actually achieve. It's important to understand that the perceptions of people have to be treated as realities that you address, even if you believe their perceptions are incorrect. Without that agreement on the major parts of the plan, it's probably going to fail. You've got to either agree or make some compromises to move later on from making the plan to being able to try it. What happens when we try to make a plan? Why might it fail? One of the main reasons it would fail is if you had an incomplete understanding of the problem. That's a big one. So if you went too fast and you got to step 2, if you didn't understand the problem, you're unlikely to be able to solve it. So what's a good some common features of good plans? When people are working together to try and solve a problem, it's good to be able to use a problem-solving strategy called work backwards. How does that work? The way that it works is that first you get the stakeholders to agree what are the positive outcomes. In other words, when we're done and we've tried the plan, what are the things that we want to achieve? So you get people to agree on that. And then you try and make them specific, and then you try and measure them. So you have to get people to agree on how to assess the outcomes. We're trying to get this outcome. And then when we check the results, did we actually get the outcome that we wanted? So if you were trying to reform school, you might say, well, we want to increase grades, or we want to increase scores on a standardized test, or we want to increase satisfaction. You need agreement on how to assess the outcomes. Once you know what the outcomes are and how you want to assess them, then design the plan. Now, the first benefit of that plan is, like I had mentioned before, the strategy is that you can work backwards from the desired outcomes. You figure out what you want, and then you ask, how do we get there? Okay, so let's say you make a plan. Now you can try the plan. What's some common characteristics of trying the plan and what you might run into? When you fail to get to actually try the plan, it's usually because you couldn't get enough agreement, enough consensus, enough approval for people to buy in order to get the final approval of that plan so that you can actually try it. Notice that at this stage, there are things like social interaction and personal politics. So if we were trying to solve a causally dense problem like immigration or the law enforcement one that we looked at this time, we noticed when we did our discussions that the social interaction and the personal politics can play a role. Now, what about when you check results? If you're going to check the results, not everyone will agree that a complex problem has been solved or sufficiently mitigated. Meaning, have we done well enough yet? And notice that our bias against doing any more work than is necessary means that we might grade too generously. And I thought, it's good enough. It solved my part of the problem. I'm okay now. So you want your plan to be one that, if it has multiple facets, it solves all of them, so that you have enough consensus to continue to go forward if it's not the case. So are our results good enough? Different stakeholder groups may be happy or they might be unhappy. So this illustrates the merits of what I had mentioned before, that if a plan defines the outcomes and establishes the way the outcomes are assessed, you're more likely to get satisfactory results. So what about when we check the results? When we check the results, ideally what's going to happen is that we're happy with them. But if we're not happy with them and we have to go back, what happens when we try and go back? Our bias is going to continue to be the least amount of work. So our first choice is going to be not to go back to step 1 or go back to step 2, but let's just go back to step 3. This is a common feature of plans that are difficult to solve. And one definition of insanity is to try the same approach over and over and expect different results. Even so, our temptation is to presume that a plan failed because our execution was lousy. And then you get finger pointing, you get a blame storm. Oh, the plan was great, you just didn't do it right. No, you didn't do it right. Now people are pointing fingers at each other. But notice the insanity in saying, let's try this thing that didn't work again, this time for sure. So that's our first preference, but it's not ideal. But if you're stuck in this loop long enough, you might say, well, maybe we need to adjust this plan. So, and then you say, okay, we'll go back to step 2 instead. Notice here, you still aren't considering this possibility. So you try the plan multiple times, it doesn't work, that's what makes you think it needs to be revised. You go back to that step, but you could still be stuck here. You can get stuck tweaking and revising plans over and over based on the continued presumption that you already understand the problem, and now you're stuck in here going through this again. We're tweaking the plan, we're trying again, we're making small changes, we're sure we know what the problem is, we just can't devise the right solution to it, and then we're stuck. Only with frustration might you finally decide, maybe we're missing something important, maybe we've got to go all the way back to step 1 and understand the problem. So a primary reason that a plan can fail is that it wasn't sufficiently or wholly understood in the first place. Going back to step 1 feels like the most work and is most likely to be the thing that we're least likely to want to do. Let's go all the way back to the drawing board and start from scratch. And remember when we talked about it earlier that that starting from scratch is really the last thing you want to do, and that it's the most work. We've got to do all that collecting and all that analyzing. Starting from scratch, a lot more work. So that's always going to be our last choice. So hope you enjoyed this 2-part thing. I know you haven't seen too much of me in a couple of weeks, so hopefully this was helpful, and we'll be able to wrap up class soon. That's it for part 2 of problem solving. Thanks, folks.